So thank you everyone for joining us. I think most of you got the introduction from me then. But essentially today, what we're going to do is JP will give an introduction in a moment, and then he'll run through the presentation. I imagine you will have questions. More questions, the better. It's a really great opportunity for you guys to actually ask your questions to JP directly. So please don't hold back. No question is a silly question. I can definitely assure you of that. So if you would put your questions in the Q&A box. So essentially as an attendee, you should have a box at the bottom and it just says Q&A. If you pop your question in there, we'll be monitoring that throughout the session, and then we will address those at the end. So if a couple of you have similar questions, we'll just maybe combine them, but don't worry, all questions will get answered at one point. And yeah, if you obviously have any questions that you want to ask just to myself or JP, so you wouldn't want anyone else to see it, then just send us a message in the chat and we can have a look. But as I say, no question is a silly question. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, JP, to introduce yourself, and I will mute myself.
Thank you so much, Grace, and thanks everyone for joining. I will share my screen and introduce myself. So thank you all for being here. So my name is Jean-Philippe. I go by JP. Feel free to call me that during the Q&A at the end. I am a strategy professor at the UCL School of Management. For those of you who are not familiar with schools of management or business schools, what we do is that we study organizations, broadly speaking. So we study how organizations are born, how they grow, how they compete, sometimes how they manage to make a profit if they are for-profit organizations. And I have become interested in studying how organizations are designed, and particularly how they can be more or less centralized or more or less decentralized. And how I got into this particular topic goes back to a project that I worked on a few years ago, which is a book called The Pirate Organization that basically tells a joint history of piracy and capitalism. And I was particularly interested at the time in the old school pirates, the ones that were on the high seas in the 17th century. And one very interesting thing about them is the way they were decentralized compared to traditional merchant marines. And so looking into the history of different forms of piracy, going into pirate radio at the beginning of the 20th century, and then into computer piracy, or hackers that started operating in the 1970s when we had the internet, but we didn't yet have the web. I found patterns of organizing that were very similar to the ones of the pirates on the seas. And so when around 2013, I started reading about Bitcoin, I was fascinated by the way Bitcoin as an organization was very decentralized. And in fact, a lot of the technological building blocks behind Bitcoin were tools coming from the field of cryptography that were designed by communities of hackers operating in the 1970s, the 1980s, a lot of them in the United States. At a time where cryptography was considered illegal by the government because it was considered a weapon. And so a lot of the history from a technological point of view that is behind Bitcoin and all the cryptocurrencies has a bit of a shady part because it comes from these illegal communities of computer pirates. So this is how I got into studying various aspects of cryptocurrencies. Why do they have value? Where does it come from? And how are they organized? How they are organized if they don't have a CEO, for instance? How do people make decisions? How do people collaborate together if there is no hierarchy, potentially? And so this is the background from which I will be speaking about the future of the internet today. So what I will be talking about is applicable to a series of decentralization technologies. So the main one that you probably are all familiar with is blockchain. And I will explain what it does from an organizational perspective and how it may or may not enable decentralization. But a lot of what I'm going to be talking about also applies to other types of decentralization technologies. Some of them are incredibly complex and you may not have heard of them, such as distributed hash tables and a few others. But I will use blockchain as an example today. So first, let's start with this notion of decentralization. I am displaying a very simple organizational chart right now. There's like a big boss, and then there's like two middle managers, and then there's like two frontline employees, if you wish, in an organization. And this organization, may appear more or less decentralized. But the trick with decentralization is that it can mean two things. On the one hand, decentralization can be about the delegation of authority. And it may look like, that enables decentralization to delegate authority within an organization. But at the same time, decentralization is also about building this hierarchy of authority, where you have different managers, but at the end of the day, all these managers have one boss, and that boss is the big boss. In a for-profit corporation, that person would be called the CEO. Sometimes it's called the president, or depending on the organization. But managerial hierarchies, eventually they leave untouched the accumulation of ultimate responsibility. So when we have managerial hierarchies, are we really increasing decentralization? It's not that obvious. So now imagine that this organization that you're looking at has decided to reorganize. And it's now looking like this. There's one big boss and there's like 4 frontline people. I want to quiz you with a very simple poll about what do you think the effect of this reorganization is on the extent of decentralization. So you get to pick one of 3 answers, and I will share the results with you. So please pick one of the 3, giving you a few seconds to make up your mind. So there's about 2/3 of you that believe that the reorganization increases decentralization. And about 25% believe that it decreases it. And then about 25% thought maybe this was a trick question. Okay, so thanks for participating. I will give an answer to this question at the end of the talk. But for now, we'll just note that there is substantial disagreement about what's going on here. And you see, we don't have a clear understanding, consensual understanding among ourselves of what it means to decentralize something, right? There's some disagreement here, which is very interesting. Okay, so let me go back to sharing my screen. Okay. So I am not seeing the option to share my screen, actually, which is odd. I don't have any of the Zoom controls.
I've just made you a host, JP, as a host of it. So hopefully you should be able to see it now. Maybe when rejoined.
Okay, what's going on? I'm not seeing the toolbar. Okay, here we go. Something odd, but I think we should be fine.
Perfect.
And now, okay. Sorry about that, guys. We're good. Okay. So the debate around decentralization comes from a diagram that was published in the 1960s, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen this before. It's a diagram published by a communications engineer. And today, if you open Google search and you type decentralized or you type distributed, this will be the first diagram that shows up in the image results, right? So you've probably seen this before. So the engineer called Paul Baran said, okay, this is the difference between centralized and decentralized, and also that other thing that he calls distributed. Now, if you look at this diagram, there's something quite interesting. That's the fact that the opposite of centralized is called distributed, right? The other extreme, distributed. And decentralization is seen as a middle point between centralization and distribution, which is, you know, a bit unusual. So what you have here is a one-dimensional kind of spectrum ranging from one single point of failure to a few points of failure to many, many points of failure, or maybe none at all, because there's so many of them. And this comes from research done during the Cold War about how to make communications networks resilient to potentially a nuclear attack. And the framing proposed in this diagram has shaped our debates until today. So for 60 years, about how we understand centralization and distribution in computer science, in network engineering, in economics, and also in management, with each of these disciplines actually having their own favorite term to define particular phenomena. And these terms, they don't align very well. To give you an example, if we go and see what they think about this in the blockchain communities, this is coming from the Ethereum community. And you will see that on their website, they actually reuse the same diagram, except that they have swapped the two terms, decentralized and distributed. You see on this new diagram that distributed is the one in the middle. There's a few points of failure. And the one where all the nodes are interconnected is called decentralized this time. So what does that mean? Does that mean that we can just pick any term we like? Does that mean that decentralization and distribution is the same thing? I don't think so. But before I tell you what I think, I'll try to explain why we should care about this. So since the invention of Bitcoin, we've had a number of blockchain networks competing with Bitcoin that have been set up to do a whole bunch of things. Now, a lot of them are actually started by entrepreneurs that are looking for funding. And instead of going to venture capitalists and say, hey, give us your money, they go to potential users and investors that are individuals and they say, hey, we're creating a token, you can buy it. And this is how they're raising funding. Now, normally when you create a share in a company and you give it to an investor, a venture capitalist, that share is called a security. And that's a legal term that comes with a whole bunch of regulations about who is allowed to create it, who is allowed to buy it, what they can do with it, how it should be taxed, how it can be transferred, to what countries, under what conditions, and blah, and blah, and blah. And every country has its own securities regulator. The big question was like, okay, if I create a blockchain network and I start selling tokens, should they be considered securities or not? A lot of the entrepreneurs that created the blockchain networks made the case that no, it's not securities because they didn't want to be regulated. Now, a few years ago, the regulator in the US said, if your network is sufficiently decentralized, then the profits are not determined by the efforts of the issuer of the token, but by the efforts of a dispersed community. And so there is no clear promoter of the investment, which will give you an exemption from securities regulation. So that means that if you are sufficiently decentralized, then you are not regulated under securities regulation. That has huge implications. But what does it mean to be sufficiently decentralized? To be able to tell if you are sufficiently decentralized, we would have to know first, what exactly is decentralization? And two, we'd have to be able to measure it to see if you're like past that threshold that qualifies you as sufficiently decentralized. Now, this is one implication of understanding decentralization, but there are many others. because it matters for intellectual property rights in digital space, also matters for regulations and constitutional rights around free speech. A lot of digital platforms have particular exemptions to regulations because they are deemed decentralized, right? So if we really need to understand decentralization to be able to see what laws apply. A recent example involving a famous digital platform called Twitter is whether one person, in this case, Elon Musk, buying the platform would basically make the platform more centralized, and if so, how does that affect free speech? Potentially, right? So you see, this is a very important issue, but despite that being very important, we still don't know what is decentralization and how we can measure it. So here's an intuition to understand the kind of decentralization that can be thought about by a technology like blockchain. Could be a blockchain, could be a different one. So imagine you're with a bunch of friends and you want to play baseball, but you don't have any equipment. So you want to create your own baseball field, right? So you gather with your friends. Maybe some of your friends will bring a baseball bat and share it with the community. Others will bring a few balls. Others will bring artifacts to create bases. Others will bring some snacks and they will share that with the team, right? So you're kind of organizing organically to be able to play baseball together. So once you've got this, makeshift homemade field set up, then maybe some of your friends will volunteer to be acting as referees. You'll be taking turns to do that. Referees will be able to say, okay, this is when a point has been scored, or this is when the game ends, or this is when we have to switch players. You will also have people who will decide whether you should be adjusting the rules, right? You all have some consensual understanding of what the rules of baseball are, but because you're playing in the back garden behind a house, maybe you want to adjust the official rules a little bit. Maybe you want to play shorter games or longer games, or you want to play on a field that's a different size of the normal size. And so you will discuss and you will decide together based on consensus how you're going to do that, to change the rules. Now, once you've done all these things, you can keep playing along baseball in a completely decentralized fashion, right? You are making all these decisions together. If one of the referees is like incompetent, says that somebody has scored a point even though they didn't even touch the ball, you can decide to replace them, and people will agree that even though they're the referee, they're not good at their job, so somebody else should do that job, right? And you'll just agree to that, and that will be fairly simple. Now imagine that we are raising the stakes. You're not just playing a baseball game with your friends, but like you start to compete against other teams. You want to start having really good players on your team. Some of them will want to be paid for it. Maybe they will want to be paid a lot of money. Then suddenly it completely changes the nature of the game because it creates incentives. Like if a particular player wants to be paid £1 million per month to play, then surely they will have incentives to win. And if they have incentives to win and there's a lot of money at stake, then perhaps some people will have incentives to try to cheat. Maybe they will try to offer money, bribes to the referees to get better outcomes for their team. Now, once you have reached this situation, it becomes really hard to remain decentralized. And that is why professional sports, all of them, all the time, everywhere in the world, no exception, are organized with centralized organizations. Professional sports clubs with a CEO, professional leagues like the basketball league, also with a CEO, etc., etc. Professional referee organizations, also with a CEO. And so as soon as you start raising the stakes, you need centralization. Now, blockchain technology and other decentralization technologies, they actually enable you to play a very high stakes game with people you don't know and you don't trust on an online platform without having to centralize and create these kind of centralized organizations to run the game. That's what they do, that's what they have in common, and that's what makes them very innovative. Now you can play high stakes games without a central authority. So blockchain can enable you to do that. Other technologies as well. Okay, so with that in mind, here's the way I'm thinking about decentralization. So first, unlike the diagram I showed you earlier, in my model, there's going to be two dimensions. First, it's the idea on one dimension, the horizontal dimension, that to be able to operate, you need information. Everybody needs to process information. And information can be more or less dispersed across people in an organization, on a digital platform, on a network, etc. And so when information is very dispersed, I call that decentralization. The other dimension on the vertical axis that I'm considering is the ability to make decisions. When decision-making power is very dispersed, I call that distribution. So when you have a distributed organization, it means that a lot of people in that organization can actually contribute to making decisions. If not, I call it concentrated. The idea here is to really distinguish these two dimensions, the dispersion of information and the dispersion of decision-making, to recognize the fact that these two things, they do not always go hand in hand. You can have a lot of information and have no decision-making authority. Or you can be a decision maker, but not have at your disposal the information you need to make the decisions. So recently in the news, I read this story about a famous world leader who some people believe is making all the decisions about the current war in the Ukraine without necessarily having information that is necessary to make those decisions. Just to illustrate this idea with a current and tragic example, that decision-making and information, they do not always go hand in hand. So now we have these two dimensions. That means that we potentially have like four ideal types, like four extreme cases, and that I will describe briefly to make sure that you understand what we're talking about here. So imagine an organization with 7 members that is centralized in terms of its information and also concentrated in terms of its decision-making. Now imagine that, you know, at the end of your academic term, you are looking for an internship in a company, right? A summer rotation. Imagine you get hired by, let's say Tesla or some other car company, but let's pick Tesla because it's pretty cool. And I'm sure a lot of you would like to work for Tesla. So imagine that there is a manager at Tesla that recruits, and that's the person in blue, recruits 6 summer interns from 6 different countries. And those are the 6 white dots, the frontline people on the diagram. And tells them, hey, you're each in charge of doing market research on one country because perhaps we are going to launch a new car. We need to decide where we're going to launch that car. So maybe one of you will be in charge of doing market research for China. One of you will be in charge of India. Another one of you will be in charge of France, which is where I come from. You probably guessed that based on my accent already. One of you will be in charge of Germany, etc. And the boss tells you, okay, at the end of your summer rotation, so you do your report, market research on your country on your own. At the end of the summer rotation, you send me your report by email, all of you. And then I will read them all. So I will basically process all the information and I will make a decision by myself. I will decide, okay, we're launching a car in Germany. That's the best opportunity. Or maybe I'm launching a car in China. In this particular case, only the person in blue has access to all information, and only the person in blue has decision-making authority. So you have full centralization, full concentration. Imagine you wanted to decentralize that particular organization. So this is how it would look like. Same setup. You're all doing a summer rotation for Tesla, but this time your manager says, okay, at the end of the summer rotation, I don't want you to send me your reports independently. I want the 6 of you to meet in one room and share what you have researched. So you're going to share all your reports, and then you're going to discuss among yourselves until you can agree which of the 6 countries is the better opportunity right now for Tesla to launch a new car. And only once you have reached consensus, you come and tell me, we have decided together that Germany is the best opportunity. And I will decide whether we launch a car in Germany or not. Now, in this case, what we have is decentralized information processing. Everybody has access to all the information because you're sharing it. But still, there's only one person making the decision. If we wanted to distribute this organization, we could add a layer of middle managers, small bosses. So maybe 2 of you would be middle managers in this case, and you would have some decision-making authority. So you're not like dark blue, but you're light blue. So maybe one of the 2 middle managers would decide on a country where to launch a car, and the other middle manager would decide what kind of car will be launched. Are we going to launch a sedan, an SUV, sports car? What kind of car? And then the big boss will make the final call. In this particular case, we have distributed decision-making in the organization. Now, if we wanted to distribute and also decentralize information at the same time, this is how it would look like. Everybody here has access to all the information, and everybody here has some decision-making authority because all the decisions about everything must be taken by consensus. Now, this is very difficult to do for all sorts of reasons that you can imagine. If people disagree, then maybe they can never make a decision together and you have complete organizational paralysis. That would suck. But in any case, what we have now is, instead of a linear model with just one dimension, which is how many points of failure do you have, we now have a 2-dimensional model with like 4 extreme ideal types and 2 dimensions, the dispersion of information and the dispersion of decision-making authority. We understand, broadly speaking, what that means, but could we find a way to measure how decentralized information is and how distributed decision-making is? So here's an example that you will all be somewhat familiar with. So imagine that the organization we're looking at right now is not Tesla anymore, it's the entire United States. The kind of information we're looking at is not reports about opportunities to launch a product, but it's about who has access to top secret information. So people who like work for the NSA, for instance, like Edward Snowden used to work for. Numbers, there's in the United States 1.5 million people, Americans, who have access to top secret information. There's about 3.5 million who have access to something called confidential information. It's a lower level of security clearance. And then the entire population, 335 million Americans, have access to public information. So imagine we only have 3 types of information, and those are the 3 types. And here's who has access to what type. And the question is, how decentralized is access to information in the United States? Can we measure it? Now we start to see, well, yeah, maybe we can measure it. To understand how we could measure it, try to imagine what would be the most decentralized possible scenario and what would be the most centralized scenario possible. The most centralized scenario possible would be one where only one person has access to top secret and confidential information, and everyone else has access to public information. And the most decentralized scenario would be everybody has access to everything. So that creates two extremes, right? Maximum decentralization, minimum decentralization. Now, how do we capture what's in between? There's various possibilities, and I'm proposing to use something called an entropy index. And some of you will be familiar with it, some of you won't, it's fine. It basically measures how randomly information is dispersed. You need to understand is like higher entropy means more random dispersion, essentially meaning more decentralization of information. So the index looks complicated because I have reworked it to standardize it to make sure that no matter what scenario I am looking at, the measure ranges between 0 for minimum decentralization and 1 for maximum decentralization. And to apply my measure and try to measure decentralization in a real world setting, all I need to know is how many categories of information are there. In this particular example I gave you, there's 3. Top secret, confidential, and public. How many people in total do we have in the organization, on the digital platform, inside the network? In this case, 335 million people. And then who has access to which type of information? And those are the little MKs in the formula. We can just plug in the numbers that I gave you. And if we did that and apply this formula, we'd get a decentralization of about 4.2%, which is, very, very close to 0. Maybe that's a good thing in this context, right? We're talking about top secret information. To show you how sensitive this particular measure is to changing the situation, if we were to multiply by 10 the number of security clearances in the US for confidential information, then the decentralization index would skyrocket to 28%, right? If there were 35 million people who could access confidential information instead of just 3.5 million. Now, think about a blockchain network or think about any digital platform that lives on the internet. The constitutive components of this platform is the nodes, the network nodes, the computers that basically communicate as part of this network. So to give you an example, on the Bitcoin platform, there's different types of nodes, right? There's about 15,000 nodes that have access to a map of all the other peer nodes in the network. They're called full listening nodes in the Bitcoin jargon. There's about 50,000 nodes that have access to the entire blockchain history. They're called full non-listening nodes. And then there's about 1 million nodes that have access to transaction pool data. They're called mining nodes. So this is a very simplified, stylized example just to show you that the reasoning that I presented to you in the context of the United States and top secret information, we can also apply it to measure decentralization potentially in the Bitcoin network. And if we use this very stylized example, we'd get a decentralization index of about 24% in this case. So this was decentralization of information. Now, what about distribution of decision-making? Well, we can apply exactly the same reasoning, but instead of looking at information categories and who has access to what kind of information, this time we're going to look at the types of decisions that agents or nodes or people can make in an organization and who can contribute to which kind of decisions. So for instance, in the United States, there's only one person that can decide to pass an executive order. That person's called the president. There's about 500 people who can decide to pass new laws. This is the US Congress. And there's about 200 million who have the right age and citizenship conditions to vote during elections, right? So if we look at these 3 types of decisions, we can compute distribution in the same way we computed decentralization. Similarly, on the Bitcoin blockchain, we could look at what kind of node can make what kind of decision, such as ordering the particular transactions in a new block of transactions, rejecting a transaction that's invalid, or broadcasting a new transaction request. And here again, there's different types of nodes that you can run on the network. They will give you different types of decision rights for different types of things. And so we can use this data to measure distribution. How many types of decisions are there? Who has access to them? and then we use a very similar index. Now, when we put these two things together, decentralization on the horizontal axis, distribution on the vertical axis, potentially we can have the organizations that are more or less distributed, more or less decentralized. And to give you an example, at the bottom here, we have an organization where there's like a boss that can make two types of decisions, type 1 and type 2. Everyone else can only make type 1 kind of decisions. And the boss also has access to all three kinds of information: blue information, green information, yellow information. And everyone else only has access to public information, which is blue. So in this case, you have minimum decentralization, minimum distribution, 0 and 0. But if we start giving frontline people access to yellow information as well, in the B scenario, then you see that you increase decentralization to 50% without touching the value of distribution, because the decision-making setup remains the same, right? So you can have these two dimensions now independently evolving between 0 and 1 across the two dimensions. Now, going back to the initial question that I asked you and that you so kindly answered. Well, when you look at what happens after the reorganization, if we make the assumption, we would have to make assumptions here, but if we make the assumption that only the big boss can make decisions, and only the big boss has access to all the information that the frontline members have collected separately, independently, then we would have decentralization equal to 0 and distribution equal to 0 after the reorganization. So those of you who said that decentralization would decrease were right in this particular case with these particular measures and the assumptions that I just shared with you. If we assume that all the frontline members are communicating between each other and sharing information, then we would get a different story. Okay, one thing I want you to keep in mind as you go through your studies and then look at job opportunities. A lot of you will be working in the digital economy, for a digital services company, for a digital platform. A lot of you want to do that. It's very exciting, right? Because these are very powerful companies for some of them, very exciting products, lots of innovation, lots of ways for you to apply your skills. It's important to recognize that today, and that's very new, we have two types of platforms out there. We have centralized platforms. So take the example of the platforms that are owned by Meta, Inc., formerly Facebook, but now it's called Meta, as you know. We must distinguish between the platform corporation, Meta, Inc., and then the digital platforms that it owns, designs, and controls, such as Facebook.com or Instagram. Well, these two things are different. There's a corporation, and then there are digital platforms, right? So when we say, oh, decentralized Facebook is, well, what are you talking about? Are you talking about Facebook, the company, or are you talking about Facebook.com, the platform? These are two different things. Okay, so a lot of the discussions that you will read in the media, for instance, or the debates that people are having, are actually very unhelpful because people are not being specific enough, and they are not defining what they're actually talking about. But more importantly, since the invention of Bitcoin and blockchain technology in 2009, it's very recent, now we have the possibility to have decentralized platforms. So what does that mean? Decentralized digital platforms, they don't have a platform corporation sitting on top that owns the digital platforms. So there is no Meta, Inc., there is no Alphabet, there is no Tencent, there is no Alibaba, there is no Kakao corporation that owns the platforms. If you look at something like Bitcoin, if you look at something like Ethereum, you don't have corporations on top. And so you don't have a CEO, and you don't have managers, and you also don't have shareholders. You don't have offices, you don't have headquarters. We're looking at something we have never seen before here. We still have the digital platform, but we don't have the platform corporation on top that owns it. This is the most exciting development in the history of the web since the invention of of the protocols that we are still using today. And you are, at a stage in your life where you will be the people that will shape this new wave of web innovation. So it's a fantastic opportunity, no matter what your background is in terms of disciplines that you're studying. Actually, with decentralized web platforms, since we don't have a corporate owner that sits on top, we can have every user or every node in the actual platform be a fractional owner of the platform. So the users of the platform can basically co-own the platform, since there is no corporation that sits on top. When that happens, we can use a digital asset called cryptocurrency, to represent the ownership stake that every user has. And that's essentially what cryptocurrency is about. There are rights that can be attached to that particular digital asset. And if these rights can be enforced automatically through something we call smart contracts, then we are going to the next level in terms of organization in a decentralized way. Now imagine we want to attach a particular digital file to that cryptocurrency, to that digital asset. Then we have something called NFT. It's a very complicated acronym, non-fungible token, to essentially say, hey, there's a cryptocurrency, but now we have a file that's attached to it. Maybe it's an audio file, maybe it's a JPEG, maybe it's a video file, but it's essentially cryptocurrency with a file attached to it. That's what an NFT is about. I imagine that we have different digital platforms that are decentralized, and we connect them. We connect them with bridges using various technologies, and essentially that allows users to transfer their digital assets across platforms. So maybe you're playing a video game on a particular platform, decentralized platform, you own an NFT that represents a special weapon for your character, or maybe it's a special piece of clothing, maybe it's a beautiful hat. Imagine that you can now transfer that hat to another character that you control in a different video game that basically sits and lives on a different decentralized platform. If you are able to do that, to transfer these digital assets, so cryptocurrency plus a file, so it's an NFT, you can transfer them across different decentralized platforms. What you have there is what we call the Metaverse. It's the ability to connect different virtual worlds, different digital platforms together so that there is persistent ownership of digital assets across them. A digital asset can be monetary, can be capital, it can also be reputation. Now, if we have a web of platforms that are co-designed and co-owned by their users, we call that Web3. You've probably heard the term. A lot of people disagree about what that means, and I'm proposing this definition, which I think is quite simple and represents a lot of what people mean when they talk about Web3. And if you have decentralized platforms that, on top of all the things I've already said, can also be autonomous, so they can perform actions on behalf of their members, maybe using smart contracts. And they can do that autonomously without the members having to press a button each time. Then what we have is a decentralized autonomous organization, also called DAO. You may have heard about that too, but that's essentially what they are and what they do. Okay, so I want you to remember that something can be more or less decentralized, right? And I've showed you how we can potentially measure that. And something can also be more or less centralized. But these two things remain different. So there's a qualitative difference between centralization and decentralization, but there's also a difference of degree between how decentralized or how centralized you can be. And there are ways to capture that. And there are ways, for instance, to be able to tell, okay, Bitcoin perhaps is more decentralized than Ethereum, but less distributed. Or Solana is more decentralized, less decentralized probably than Ethereum, right? We can measure these things now. And that has lots of implications. So a service that you may be familiar with is Dropbox. It's a cloud storage service where essentially there's a corporation called Dropbox Inc. that sits on top of a digital platform where you as a user pay to store your data on the corporate-owned servers of Dropbox Inc. So it's a fairly centralized kind of platform. But now there's a competitor to Dropbox that's completely decentralized, or that at least is on the decentralized side of the spectrum, and it's called the Interplanetary File System, IPFS. They're directly competing with Dropbox, but using a decentralized infrastructure. You've probably heard of IPFS. If not, I encourage you to look them up. They're doing some very interesting stuff. They even allow some people to store their NFTs there to make sure they don't disappear. Okay, so a quick summary. The opposite of centralized is not distributed. I propose that we call it decentralized. And you might be thinking, well, duh, JP, it's kind of obvious. No, it's not. Actually, for the past 60 years, it hasn't been. I'm also proposing that there's two important dimensions to consider: the dispersion of information and the dispersion of decision-making. Both should be measurable. And then the bigger implication here is that if you believe that there cannot be power without the ability to know stuff, which is about information, and without the ability to do stuff, which is about decision-making, then essentially decentralization and distribution, they provide foundations to understand and reconceptualize the notion of power in the digital economy. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. We have 12 minutes left for a Q&A. I encourage you to stay in touch no matter what. You got my email, you got my Twitter handle, you got like a QR code that you can scan from your LinkedIn app on your phone, and you can add me on LinkedIn. That's brilliant. I also want to share with you a couple of things if you want to read more about this. One is a paper that's open. There's no paywall. That you can find on my website or my Twitter account that really goes deeper into the implications of decentralization and distribution for two technologies, blockchain that I've talked about today, and artificial intelligence, machine learning more specifically, which is something that a lot of you are interested in. So I encourage you to take a look. And then another thing, if you like the piece about piracy, you can look for a video on YouTube called "What is the Pirate Organization?" And that's an animation movie that I produced a few years ago that basically summarizes the book in 5 minutes, and it's quite fun. So you can take a look at that too. All right, moving on to the Q&A now. Grace, do you want to share some of the questions with me, or shall we just let people open their mic and go ahead?
Yeah, so I think we've had a bit of a shy audience in terms of putting them in as we've gone, but to be honest, it is hard when you've got a question, you're still trying to listen. So I do understand that. So if you do have questions, you can either pop them in the Q&A, or if you prefer, you can raise your hand and then we can allow you to speak. So you can just open up your microphone and ask the question directly. Sometimes that's easier. So if you'd like to do that, then let us know. We've also got a couple of questions that were sent in, but we'd prefer to do the live questions first and prioritize those, and we can do the other ones after. So yeah, either raise your hand or pop them in the Q&A box. I can see we have one though, that's just come in the Q&A. So what are your thoughts about combating fraud in cryptocurrency?
Yep. So that's a very big question. Because there's many different types of fraud in cryptocurrency. Some of them are going through the network channel. Some of them are going through a social channel. Some of them are specifically targeting people who are trading NFTs. So some of them involve tax evasion. So there's a lot of different kinds of fraud. So I'm not going to go into the details. What I can say though is that there's been a lingering impression, which I think is misleading, that cryptocurrency in general is enabling criminal activity or illegal activity. That, if you're selling drugs, illegal drugs or illegal weapons, now with cryptocurrency, it's a lot easier to do it. that there's a lot of evidence showing that it's not the case. And for one simple reason is that the blockchain itself on which cryptocurrency transactions are recorded has some degree of permanence. So every time there's a transaction that's basically happening in cryptocurrency, it will live in the blockchain forever. Now, if you want to buy illegal drugs, I'm not saying you should, or if you want to buy weapons, same thing, you shouldn't. And you want to stay anonymous, you don't want to get caught. The best thing out there is cash, because cash is anonymous and cash is untraceable. If you are recording forever a purchase of illegal drugs or weapons in the blockchain, then it's really helping law enforcement track down the transaction and try to reconnect it to people's real world identities. So there are new issues posed by cryptocurrency around fraud, but the reality is that because it records all the transactions, it is not true that cryptocurrency makes it easier for illegal activity to be conducted.
Perfect, thank you. And we've got a couple of questions in the chat as well. So we have the next one that came through was from Lucas, and he says, thank you, very interesting talk, especially the difference between decentralization and distribution. The main question is, what would you say that blockchain and NFT-based systems will one day replace the entire patent system? I wonder if you meant payment, but I'm not sure there.
Okay, so Lucas, yeah, that's a great question. I think there are people who are trying to see how blockchains can be used to record titles of intellectual property. So that involves patents, that involves copyrights, and potentially also trademarks. Now, what people are not talking about is a replacement of the current system, but just using blockchain as a channel to make the current system more efficient, more easy to use, more easy to trace. So I think that there's a lot of potential for blockchain to make the current system more efficient. I haven't seen yet a way to use blockchain to replace the existing system, but it could certainly be made more efficient. So one example of that is maybe not with patent, but with copyrights, is that currently, imagine you're an artist, you're a painter, okay? You make a painting. You are represented by an art gallery in the city. Your painting is for sale for £10,000. Somebody buys it. The gallery calls you and say, hey, we just sold one of your paintings. Here's your cut. Your cut typically will be 50%. So the gallery keeps 5,000, you get 5,000. And then somebody bought that piece. They are now the owner of the piece. Imagine that you become incredibly famous and the price of your art becomes incredibly high, which I wish for you. And a few years later, that art collector that bought your piece for 10,000 can resell it to another art collector for 1 million. Right? So they're making 100 times on their initial investment. You will get nothing. As the original artist, you will get nothing. In most of the time, most of the cases, unless you have a very special deal with your art gallery. If you are doing that on the blockchain using NFTs, then you can embed a piece of code in the initial NFT contract that will say that for every resale of the artwork, digital artwork, after the initial sale, the artist will get 5% or 10%, and you can write that in code. And as soon as the NFT is transferred for the second time, the third time, the fourth time to a new buyer, you will automatically get that commission sent to your digital wallet. So that's an example of how the intellectual property rights system can be made more efficient and potentially more beneficial to the creators using blockchain. There's a related question by Ashley asking, what is the future of NFTs? Are they sustainable in the long run? Yes, but I want to clarify what I mean by yes. NFT is essentially fractionalizable digital property. Is there a future for that? Absolutely. NFTs are going to stick around because they enable us to do things that we couldn't do before. Many, many different things. Now, when I say that, I am not implying that the value of any kind of NFT will remain where it is. Most NFTs are, especially in the digital art space, are bad, have no artistic value. People claim that they are rare, but they are not really rare. They're kind of limited editions of artworks, but the creators can create an unlimited amount of these limited editions. So the scarcity is not guaranteed. And so the value of most NFTs in the digital art space will go down to zero. And the value of many of them already has collapsed. So the concept and what it can do definitely has a long-term future. It's here to stay, but it doesn't mean that all of them will be valuable. In fact, most of them will have zero value.
Perfect, thank you. We've got some in the Q&A. So somebody has asked, what is the incentive for people to move from Web 2 to Web 3?
Sorry, one more time.
What is the incentive for people to move from Web 2 to Web 3?
Well, it depends on the people. That's a great question. I think if I were currently a student in the Faculty of Engineering, interested in computer science, interested in software engineering, interested in digital entrepreneurship, digital business, I would definitely want to dive deep into Web3 because this is the next wave of innovation. Now, if I am the CEO of Google, or if I am the CEO of Facebook, my incentives are very different because I am basically at the helm of a Web2 empire. And you may have noticed that companies like Google have not invested in blockchain. They have claimed multiple times that they were getting into it, that they will, start hiring people and developing products and blah and blah. They haven't done any of that. And they know that the very nature of what blockchain can do goes against their short-term business interests. And so, if you work for Google, your incentives to go into Web3 are very low. What's happening now, and I know people who have been doing it, I have friends of mine even, people who had jobs for these big so-called tech companies, Google, Facebook, Tencent, Alibaba, or whatnot, are leaving to take a job at a Web3 startup, leaving their positions. And so that is something that's been happening for the past 18 months at a scale that I'd never seen before. Nobody was doing that 3 years ago. But in the past 18 months, this has become a trend. So employees of these companies that are not making the move are leaving to make the move on their own independently as part of a startup or another company. What are your thoughts on El Salvador using Bitcoin as legal tender? Well, I don't feel strongly either way, dear anonymous attendee. I think it's interesting to see that El Salvador has made the move. The Central African Republic, I think, has been the second country in the last few days to make the move, and the first one in Africa. There will be other countries that do that. They tend to be countries that are not huge in terms of their economy or their population. So the impact on how people see the potential of cryptocurrency for nation states is still hard to gauge. So I would say these are interesting experiments and I'm following them closely. I don't know where they will end, but it's definitely experiments that should be followed, and a lot of companies, a lot of startups are looking very closely at what these countries are doing. If they screw up, if there's corruption, if there's no real benefits for the population, it will hurt the reputation of cryptocurrency, will be a temporary setback. If they do good things, then it will accelerate the change, but the change will happen no matter what, I think.
Thank you. JP, can you see the questions, or do you want me to read them out? Or
I can. Yeah, there's two different windows, so I can see them. I think I'll just pick some of them. So there's a question by Joe. with a finite supply of Bitcoin tokens to resist inflation effects, what do you believe the future impacts of people supporting the network will be, as the incentives to continue doing so will become more difficult to obtain? Yeah, that's a very tough question you're asking here. And that's a question that people in the Bitcoin community are discussing heavily. So people right now who are joining as a mining node, the Bitcoin network, get rewarded because new Bitcoin is being created every 10 minutes. Now, at some point, there won't be any new Bitcoin being created because we will have reached the maximum. And so how are these people going to be incentivized to contribute? Well, the only way to do that under current rules is to have transaction fees that people pay every time they make a transaction cover the costs of these miners. And so this is basically what we expect to happen. If fewer miners are present because of these lower incentives in the future, the difficulty of being a miner will be adjusted automatically by the Bitcoin network. And that's the beauty of it. There's like a dynamic adjustment of the organization that is programmed into the software. And this is what we have seen in the past already when there's been a lot of movement among miners. So it's still a bit of an open question, but my big picture answer is increasing transaction fees, which means that the main Bitcoin blockchain probably won't ever be able to handle micropayments, for instance, but there can be solutions developed on layer 2 and even layer 3 to be able to manage that. Okay, another question is, to what extent will the decentralized society affect the pre-existing capitalism? Is it possible that decentralized society will lead to socialism or communism? I love this question, and I am realizing that we have reached the end of our time, so that will be the last question I will answer. If you have another question that you have asked and I did not answer, I am sorry, there was a lot of them. Feel free to just shoot me an email with your question, copy paste it in an email or in a tweet or LinkedIn, and I promise you I will reply by the end of the day. Okay, so last question, and I love it. So indeed, if we have decentralized ownership, if we don't have corporate owners anymore, and the users are basically co-owning the digital platforms and the companies basically that are operating on the web, doesn't it look like socialism? Doesn't it look like communism? Doesn't it look like this idea that the means of production should be owned by the workers? And indeed, there is a parallel that can be made here. And that's a hotly debated issue in the community. The difference between the hardcore libertarians that you will find in the blockchain communities and the people that see a form of socialism or communism in there is their stance on the notion of private property. If you have co-ownership by the users of a platform, but that property is deemed to be a common good, then you are on the socialism side. If you have co-ownership by the user, but each user has private property rights on the share that they own, then you are on the side of libertarianism. And there are implications to these two paths that can be taken. Right now, the blockchain communities are firmly on the side of private property. And so the grain of socialist organization that you are hinting at, and I think it's a great remark you are making, has not grown yet into a full-blown idea, but it is present, it has been planted. And we will see how the situation evolves in the coming years. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Grace, for organizing in the UCL School of Management. And thank you for sharing my email in the chat window now. You have no excuse for not asking your question again if I fail to answer it today.
Perfect. Thank you very much, guys. And just to let you all know, you will be emailed by UCL, and it will have a link to where you can find the recording if you did want to kind of go over anything that you've heard today. But thank you all for joining us, and thanks so much, JP, for a really interesting talk. That was great.
Thank you.
Lovely.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.